Good morning and welcome to another videocast from Hindi Consulting, the specialist management consulting firm for the $125 billion FPD display industry. And today I'd like to talk about what I call the innovation ladder. And it's basically the tiers of difficulty of technology in the display industry. And I'd like to then position the display majors against that and then talk about the implications of access to different tiers of the marketplace and key decisions and technologies that those leading players might want to think about adopting. So it's got its particular relevance to the Chinese players in particular, since they're further down the rankings, but it also contains my opinions on where I would find each one of the different display players in terms of their innovation strength. So I understand that this is completely subjective, but this is my own ranking then in terms of innovation of the display majors in terms of levels of difficulty. So frankly, by now, if you can afford to buy the tools and put up the factory, there's a pretty good chance you can pull off a standard amorphous silicon fab. So that's also typically the place that new countries to the display industry might think of starting. It's probably the simplest thing, even though there are still quite another number of competencies that have to be managed, and typically I would advocate that people either buy and build, or they start with module assembly and then work back to the hardcore work of TFT building. But that's within the big picture, that is actually the simplest level, and in the display industry there are probably 20 to 30 such players who have amorphous silicon type capabilities. Now rank 2 and 3 are actually really fascinating because if I did this 10 years ago, this would definitely not be in this order here. But actually I would argue from this point of view that because of the role of the equipment industry, that actually standard and flex OLED then are actually ranks 2 and 3. It has actually made it where, again, you can broadly go out and buy the equipment and hire some engineers to come from other companies, and you could probably pull off technically what it takes to do a glass-on-glass OLED, or then one level higher and pull off flex OLED. Now that doesn't mean you can be a market leader, and it certainly doesn't mean that you'll have full load, and that certainly doesn't mean that you'll be hyper competitive, or you will have yields in the really high numbers. But certainly it does mean that you can pretty much go out, get equipment and put together something if you're thinking of the world of standard or flex OLED. So then I started in my mind turning over then what builds the highest tiers, and I decided to put Oxide and LTPO as the next tier up, and largely that's because Oxide for now is actually a very poorly understood technology in terms of management of traps at the interfaces, the quality of the semiconductor itself, and the device physics are fundamentally different to do with anything else that display players have looked at before. And so actually you could argue that LGD and Sharp are probably the only two companies that are really world masters at this, and then Samsung probably a more recent joiner, but also then the market leader in what they call HOP, which is low temperature polyoxide, the Apple technology. So I would actually put that pretty close to the top echelons of a capability at innovation in displays. Fundamentally then I leave the highest rank for two companies and two companies only, and that's the ability to fundamentally pull off a complex new display architecture and ecosystem. So there's two parts to that. There's the architecture, which is the technical part, and an ecosystem, which is bringing together all of the material suppliers, the equipment suppliers, and the customer set to pull off a completely new, typically large panel display system. And here this is where I would say the two Koreans excel, and probably no one other than the two Koreans sit at the top of the cycle. So if we actually try and score people against that, then this is where it probably then brings out the implications for the Chinese players. So amongst all of those that can compete at standard amorphous silicon, in terms of the major players, would be HKC. Now they have 4 large Gen 8 fabs, 38 million square meters of large Gen capacity, and they have definitely been trying to look at both LEAP and V-Technology OLED related equipment to try and jump up into the higher echelons. So that's actually almost trying to jump to level 5. But I would argue that that on its own is actually quite a difficult feat to pull off. And one of the enabling technology, at least for most large panel emissives, is a very decent understanding of oxide technology. So it's almost like from here, if you're a large panel player, you can jump steps 2 and 3 perhaps, although certainly some understanding of actually depositing OLED might be a pretty useful skill. But then you would be running into the realms of levels 4 and 5 for a large panel, and that's what HKC does. It's a pretty big jump for them to go, and you can see that one of the motivations they had behind an IPO that they were trying but haven't pulled off yet is to invest then in fundamental technology in oxide, and that is to move them up to level 4 here, and with a potential then to move up higher. If you then look at actually most of the Chinese, I would actually arguably score the 4 big other Chinese players all at between level 2 and level 3. BOE is probably slightly the most advanced, at least in terms of capacity. China Star I would position in terms of being slightly advanced in terms of strategic bets and innovation. But BOE, Visionox, China Star and Tianma all have fundamental capabilities of both glass OLED and Flex OLED, and at least 30k sheets in each case, Gen 6 of capacity, so an ability to play, with BOE quite substantially ahead of that. Visionox also having multiple investments. Of those, I would actually argue the one that's got the greatest potential for an innovation engine is China Star, with their work with Japan Inc. on printed OLED and printed QDEL. And this is really the fascination for me. The question becomes, if you're in a tier 2 to 3 position, which you've established through broadly innovations that were brought to the market by other players and then spread about by access to equipment, will the Chinese players have enough innovation capability on their own to jump into the top echelons? This is a really important question for me, because they seem to be really starting from, well, prove to me who of the Koreans has already adopted this, and then I might think of taking on that technology. And that in itself is not the innovation capability that will put them in the same highest ranks as LGD and STC. And I think actually this is why I score China Star probably the highest of that bunch of 4, is because they're trying. They're using links to Japan Inc. to get there, but they're trying to use that plus Chinese innovation, particularly a relationship with Juhua, to work at inkjet printing and fundamentally pulling that off with QDEL. So it's that thrust that slightly higher positions China Star, to my mind, than the others. If we go up to the rest of the rankings of the board, then I would actually argue that Sharp, as one of the very few true masters of oxide, is actually a level higher. And in the past, Sharp has actually proven an ability to fundamentally innovate with displays. And to me, it is a shame that they could have pulled off so much as being part of the Foxconn group with the sufficient backing. If heads had been banged together and they'd really pulled off a combination of the best talent from Innolux and Sharp, they could really also be amongst the leaders on the top of this board here. As I leave it now, I'd put Sharp in a stage 4 level process. And then finally, it really does leave the 2 Koreans as the true masters of innovation in display technology. They have the fundamental capability to pull off a complete ecosystem, and so that by that I mean equipment and materials and downstream customers to pull off a fundamentally new technology. And in cases, what could you argue? You could argue that LGD came up over a decade before Samsung with its white OLED product, and now Samsung SDC both came up with Flex OLED and with QD-OLED. So for me, they rank by far ahead of the leadership board. And this is really where then the protectionism that comes in from the Korean government to ongoingly secure the role of LGD and SDC at the top of this leadership board becomes really important. So anyway, this is my idea of an innovation ladder for the display industry. And what I'm trying to also infer is which steps each of the players should take next. I would actually argue that for HKC, yes, getting fundamentally into oxide is probably a precursor to large panel OLED attempts that they're trying to put on the table. For BOE, it's securing the incremental step, probably into LTPO, but then also finding a pathway to a fundamental new source of innovation to rise to ranks 4 to 5. For China Star, they're definitely trying, and I think they have the greatest chances so far of jumping into the 4 to 5 ranks. Tianma also, for me, is a very solid management team, and again, it's where are they going to find the innovation source that allows them to jump into the highest ranks? Is that going to be based on something that could be generated in China, or whether that's something that has to come from Taiwan or from Japan as a lever to jumping up to the top tiers? So there are. This is my innovation ranking for the total global $125 billion display industry, and where I would see each of the players on that list. And I hope you found that interesting. Have a good day.